Welcome back to the channel. It's Formula Park One. We showcase amateur athletes and amateur news every day. If you're a player or coach would like an interview, DM me for a collaboration. And if you're loving the content, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Today, we'll talk about the college football scores over the weekend. And the first game up is Alabama versus Eastern Illinois. And Kevin Riley had a solid game with 8 carries, 36 carries, and 2 touchdowns. And AK Deer had 9 rushes for 45 yards and 2 touchdowns. And Alabama won the matchup 56 to nothing. Next game up is BYU versus Cincinnati. And BYU won 26 to 14 behind Barry Boschmeyer, who had 13 carries, 46 yards for 1 touchdown, and LJ Martin, who had 32 carries for 222 yards and 2 touchdowns. Next game we're going to talk about is Texas A&M versus Stanford, and Texas A&M won 48 to nothing behind Marcel Reed, who had 10 for 15 for 120 yards and 3 touchdowns, and Amari Daniels, who had 9 carries for 106 yards and 1 touchdown. The next game we're going to talk about is Ohio State versus Rutgers. And Ohio State won 42 to 9 behind Julian Sion, who went 13 for 19, 157 yards, 2 touchdowns. Great effort. And Max Clare, who had 7 receptions for 105 yards and 1 touchdown. Next game we have is Notre Dame versus Syracuse, and Notre Dame won by a landslide, 70 to 7 behind Jeremiah Love, who had 8 carries for 171 yards and 3 touchdowns, and C.J. Carr had went 5 for 9 for 49 yards and 1 touchdown. And the next game up is Charlotte versus Georgia. And Georgia won 35 to 3 behind Gunnar Stockton, who went 17 for 21, 196 yards. And Bo Walker had 9 carries for 48 yards and 3 touchdowns. And Georgia won 35 to 3. Next game we had was USC versus Oregon, and Oregon came out victorious 42 to 7 behind Dante Moore, who went 22 for 30, 257 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception, and Noah Wintington, who had 19 carries for 104 yards and averaging over 5 yards per carry. Next game we're going to talk about is Utah versus Kansas State, and Utah won 51 to 47 behind Devon Dampier, who went 18 for 33, 259 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And he also had 14 carries for 94 yards, averaging over 6 yards per carry and 2 touchdowns. And the next game we're going to talk about is Miami versus Virginia Tech. And Miami won 34 to 17 behind Carson Beck, who went 27 for 32, 320 yards and 4 touchdowns, and Malachi Tony, who had 12 carries for 146 yards and 1 touchdown. All right, the next game we got is Tulane versus Temple. And Tulane won 37 to 13 behind Jake Ratcliffe, who went 17 for 28, 231 yards, 2 touchdowns, and Shaz Preston had 5 receptions for 96 yards and 1 touchdown. And Arizona State versus Colorado is the next matchup, and Arizona State won 42 to 17 behind Jeff Simmons, who went 11 for 24, 206 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And Relic Brown had 22 carries, 255 yards, and 1 touchdown. A great win for the Sun Devils. The next matchup we got is TCU versus Houston. In a close matchup, TCU won 17 to 14 behind Josh Hoover, who went 24 for 33, 243 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 3 intercepts, and Jeremy Payne, who had 18 carries for 103 yards. Great win for TCU. The next game we're going to talk about is Illinois versus Wisconsin, and Wisconsin won 27-10 behind Darian Dupree, who had 17 carries, 131 yards, and averaging over 7 yards per rush and 2 touchdowns. The next matchup we're going to talk about is Tennessee versus Florida, a SEC matchup, and Tennessee won 31-11 behind Joey Aguilar, who went 17 for 22, 204 yards, 1 touchdown, and Deshaun Bishop, who had 24 carries, 116 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And the next game we're going to talk about is Michigan versus Maryland. And Michigan won 45-20 behind a solid game from the freshman quarterback Bryce Underwood, who went 60 for 23, 210 yards, and 2 touchdowns, and Bryson Kinsdale, who had 20 carries for 100 yards and 3 touchdowns. And the next game we're going to talk about is Arkansas versus Texas. And Texas won 52-37 behind Arch Manning, who went 18 for 30, 389 yards, 4 touchdowns, and Parker Livingston, who had 2 receptions for 104 yards and 1 touchdown. And the next game we're going to talk about is Pittsburgh versus Georgia Tech. And Pittsburgh won 42-28 behind Mason Hinsdale, who went 20 for 27, 226 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Kenny Johnson, who had 6 receptions for 96 yards and 1 touchdown. And the last game that we're going to talk about is Kentucky versus Vanderbilt. And Vanderbilt won 45-17 behind Diego Pavey, who went 33 for 39, 484 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, and 1 interception. And he had a great game on the ground also. He had 15 carries for 48 yards, averaging 3 yards per carry and 1 touchdown. Great win for Vanderbilt. For all your amateur news and your college ball content, subscribe to Formula Park 1 on YouTube. Thank you for your support.